The rain came down in sheets as I pulled off the highway and onto the quiet street leading to my house. The sky was already darkening despite it being mid-afternoon, the thick clouds swallowing what little light remained. My phone buzzed on the seat next to me, but I ignored it. Work had been exhausting, and I needed a break from everything, even texts. I wasn't supposed to be home until late. A big client presentation was scheduled for that evening, but the client had cancelled at the last minute, leaving me with nothing but time. For once, I decided not to tell my wife, Rebecca. I thought it might be a fun surprise. Maybe we could spend the afternoon together, cook dinner, or just sit on the couch like we used to before life became so predictable. The lights in the house were off, but her car was in the driveway. I figured she was napping or binge-watching one of her shows with headphones in, oblivious to the storm outside. As I walked to the front door, something felt off. The air carried a strange stillness, like the calm before a storm. I unlocked the door quietly and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of vanilla, but underneath it was something else. A musky scent I couldn't place. "Rebecca?" I called out, but there was no reply. Shrugging off my jacket, I placed my bag on the kitchen counter. The floor creaked underfoot as I walked toward the living room, peeking around the corner. Nothing. The television was off, the blanket still neatly folded on the couch. I took the stairs two at a time, heading straight for our bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the sliver of light coming from inside. I pushed it open without thinking. Rebecca was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed but wide-eyed as if I'd startled her. She seemed relieved when she saw it was me. "Daniel." "I didn't hear you come in," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I got off work early. Thought I'd surprise you." I smiled, but something in her eyes didn't match mine. "Oh, that's nice." I was just lying down. I looked at her closely. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she kept glancing at her phone, which was face down on the nightstand. "Everything okay?" I asked, stepping closer. "Yeah, just tired," she replied too quickly. I didn't press. Instead, I sat down next to her, leaning in for a kiss. She pulled away almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to notice. My stomach twisted. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking. It had been a stressful week for both of us. "I'll make some tea," I offered, standing. Rebecca nodded. "Sure. I'll be down in a minute." As I headed downstairs, I felt like I had walked into the middle of a scene where I didn't know my lines. Something was unfolding around me, and I wasn't in on it. I was reaching for the kettle when I heard a noise, a faint creak from the hallway upstairs. I froze. Rebecca was supposed to be alone up there. Setting the kettle down, I moved quietly to the foot of the stairs. The creak came again, this time louder. I listened carefully, my heart hammering. And then I heard it. A hushed voice. A man's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking the tone. I swallowed, the blood draining from my face. The logical part of me tried to offer explanations. Maybe it was the TV, or maybe I misheard. But I knew better. I took each step carefully, heart pounding louder with every inch I climbed. As I approached the top, the voices stopped abruptly. I turned toward the guest room, the door shut but not completely closed. For a long moment, I stood there, unsure of what I'd find on the other side. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was unmade, but nothing seemed out of place. I lingered, scanning the room, until my eyes landed on something half-hidden under the bed. A pair of black shoes. Men's shoes. They didn't belong to me. Before I could think, I heard Rebecca's voice from the hall. "Daniel?" I spun around to see her standing there, eyes wide and lips slightly parted. She looked past me, her gaze flickering toward the shoes I had just uncovered. Her face paled. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, waiting for an explanation I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Rebecca opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, a door creaked at the end of the hallway, our closet door. Someone was inside. The hallway felt suffocatingly narrow as Rebecca and I locked eyes, the silence between us louder than the storm outside. Her gaze darted toward the closet door, and she instinctively stepped in front of it, as if to shield whatever, or whoever, was inside. Daniel, she started, her voice tight. Let me explain. I held up a hand. Don't. I wasn't ready to hear whatever excuses she was about to make. My chest tightened with each second that passed, and the rational part of my mind was rapidly losing ground to something darker, something primal. I stepped around her before she could stop me, hand reaching for the closet doorknob. She grabbed my arm, her grip shaking. Daniel, please. I shook her off, the force of it surprising even me. The door creaked open under my hand, inch by inch. At first, I saw nothing but my work shirts and jackets hanging neatly in place. Then, slowly, I lowered my gaze. A man crouched in the far corner, half hidden by the shadows of my own clothes. His hair was disheveled, his expression frozen in that awkward space between guilt and fear. He wasn't a stranger. I knew him. His name was Ethan. One of Rebecca's colleagues. Ethan worked in her office, the guy she had casually mentioned in conversations over dinner, the one she barely talked to. I stared at him, trying to process what I was seeing. He was barefoot, his socks clutched tightly in one hand, as if he had scrambled to hide at the last possible moment. The air in the closet felt thick, like I was drowning in it. What the hell are you doing in my house? I asked, my voice low and steady, but laced with ice. Ethan swallowed visibly but didn't speak. His eyes flickered toward Rebecca. I turned to her, waiting for an explanation. She stepped forward, wringing her hands. It's not what it looks like, Daniel, she began. I laughed under my breath, though nothing about this was funny. It looks like there's a man hiding in my closet. A man who shouldn't be here. It's complicated, she whispered. I clenched my jaw. Make it simple. Rebecca hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But her eyes lowered to the floor, and I saw it, the choice to lie, right there in the slump of her shoulders. I was just helping him, she said softly, barely able to meet my gaze. He had a fight with his girlfriend. He needed somewhere to stay for a while. I let the words hang between us, hollow and weightless. Helping him? I repeated, glancing at Ethan, who was still crouched awkwardly in the closet. And he needed to hide in my closet barefoot while doing it? Ethan finally stood, brushing imaginary dust off his pants as if that would somehow restore his dignity. Look, man, I think I should just leave. I stepped in his path before he could make it to the door. You're not going anywhere, I growled. His eyes darted to Rebecca again. Rebecca, tell him. This is getting blown out of proportion. Blown out of proportion. I stared at Ethan, and the realization hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't a one-time thing. This wasn't some accident. The familiarity between them, the subtle cues, the way they exchanged glances, spoke volumes. How long? I asked quietly. Rebecca stiffened. Daniel, How long, Rebecca? I interrupted sharply, my patience thinning by the second. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally, she sighed. A few months. I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek to stop the storm of emotions rising in me. I see, I replied, stepping back. Ethan inched toward the door, testing the waters. I didn't stop him this time. He grabbed his shoes from under the bed, muttering an apology as he slipped past me and down the stairs. I heard the front door open and close behind him. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had felt in years. Rebecca sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Daniel," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. I watched her carefully. "You let it happen," I replied coldly. She looked up at me then, tears brimming in her eyes. But I couldn't tell if it was guilt or just regret for being caught. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. "I need some air," I said, grabbing my keys from the counter. I left without another word, stepping into the rain. But as I stood outside, drenched and shaking, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rain hammered down as I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there, parked just down the street from my house, but the storm outside mirrored the one raging in my chest. Rebecca's face flashed in my mind, her downcast eyes, the faint tremble in her voice. I wanted to believe she felt guilty. I wanted to believe she regretted it. But something about the way she had protected Ethan in that moment told me otherwise. This wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was calculated, hidden away until it spilled out in the form of a man crouched in my closet. I watched as the house remained still. No lights turned on. No frantic calls or texts came through. It was almost as if Rebecca assumed I would simply disappear into the rain and forget everything. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead of driving off, I picked up my phone and scrolled through my texts until I found the one I was looking for. "Ryan, let's grab a drink later." Ryan was my closest friend and someone I could count on to tell me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. I tapped out a quick message. "Me, now. Meet me at O'Malley's." O'Malley's was a small pub a few blocks away, tucked between a laundromat and an old bookstore. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, and tonight, I needed quiet. By the time I arrived, Ryan was already there, nursing a beer at the corner booth. His eyes narrowed as I slid into the seat across from him. "You look like hell," he said, taking a sip. I gave a dry laugh. "Feels about right." Ryan didn't press immediately. He leaned back in the booth, watching me carefully, waiting for me to start talking. That was Ryan's way, always patient, never forcing anything. "I came home early today," I said after a long pause. His brow arched. "And?" "There was a man in my closet." Ryan nearly choked on his drink. "Wait, what?" I recounted the story, sparing no detail. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to quiet anger. "That son of a..." Ryan started but stopped short when he saw my face. He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "I don't get it." Rebecca never struck me as the type. "Me either," I muttered. He set his glass down hard enough to make it rattle. "What are you going to do?" That was the question I had been circling since I left the house. Confront her again? Pack my bags and leave? I didn't know if I wanted to fix things or watch them burn. "I don't know," I admitted. Ryan leaned in, lowering his voice. "Look, I know you love her, but if she's been sneaking around for months, it's not just some stupid mistake. That's a choice." I nodded. "I get it." We sat in silence for a while, the rain tapping against the windows like fingers drumming on glass. Then Ryan spoke again, more cautiously this time. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "Has she ever done anything like this before?" I frowned, shaking my head. "No. At least. I don't think so." Ryan didn't look convinced. "What are you getting at?" I pressed. He hesitated before answering. "It's just, when I was at your place for the barbecue last month, Rebecca was on her phone a lot." I remember thinking it was odd, but I didn't mention it. Thought maybe it was work stuff. I stared at him. You think it was Ethan? I don't know. Maybe. The idea sat heavily between us. I replayed moments in my head, Rebecca's late nights at the office, the unexplained weekends with her friends, the moments she seemed distant. I had brushed it off as normal, but now I wasn't so sure. I need to know the truth, I said finally. Ryan nodded. Then find it. I didn't return home right away. Instead, I drove around the city aimlessly, trying to clear my head. But as the hours dragged on, one thought lingered: I couldn't let this go until I had all the answers. The next morning, I woke early and called in sick to work. Rebecca was still asleep when I left, and I was glad for the distance. I parked near her office building and waited. By noon, I saw her exit, dressed perfectly as always, laughing at something one of her coworkers said. And trailing just a few steps behind her, Ethan. They didn't touch. They didn't even walk too closely. But there was something in the way they moved, an ease between them that set my teeth on edge. I followed at a safe distance as they crossed the street, entering a small cafe on the corner. They sat by the window, and I watched from my car, heart pounding as Rebecca leaned in, touching Ethan's arm as she whispered something. His hand rested briefly on hers, then pulled away. I had seen enough. Grabbing my phone, I snapped a photo through the windshield. Evidence, if nothing else. As I stared at the picture, my mind raced. This wasn't over, not until I uncovered everything. The cafe window framed them perfectly, Rebecca leaning in, her soft laugh spilling out into the afternoon air. Ethan's eyes lingered on her just a little too long. Even from across the street, I could see the undercurrent of something more between them. I tightened my grip on the phone, staring at the photo I had just taken. I told myself I needed this as proof, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't planning to use it in a divorce. I wasn't even sure I wanted to confront Rebecca with it. I just needed to understand why. I stayed in the car for over an hour, watching as they talked like old friends catching up. Nothing overtly intimate happened. No kissing, no holding hands. Just quiet, subtle tension that was loud enough for me to hear it from where I sat today. But just as I was about to leave, something shifted. Ethan got up first, glancing over his shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Rebecca followed a few minutes later. They exited through separate doors, Ethan out the front, Rebecca through a side alley that wrapped around the back of the cafe. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to follow her. The alley behind the cafe was empty, but I spotted Rebecca slipping into a small, unmarked building a block away. It wasn't an office or a store, just a plain brick structure with tinted glass windows and no signage. I parked quickly and crossed the street on foot, careful to stay out of view. By the time I reached the door she had entered, I realized something strange. The building wasn't empty. Through a crack in the blinds, I caught glimpses of people inside, at least 4 or 5. A faint hum of conversation drifted through the thin walls. I edged closer, heart pounding. This didn't feel like a secret rendezvous spot for an affair. There was something else going on here. A minute later, the door opened, and I quickly ducked behind a parked car. 2 men stepped out, both wearing dark suits and carrying briefcases. They weren't the type of people I expected to see coming from a rundown, unmarked building. Rebecca emerged next, standing in the doorway and shaking hands with someone still inside. Her expression was serious, focused in a way I rarely saw. Then, as she turned to leave, her phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the pavement. I watched as she crouched to pick it up, the screen lighting up in the process. From where I was crouched, I couldn't read everything, but one word flashed clearly in bold letters at the top of the screen. Transfer complete. I frowned. Transfer? Rebecca quickly stuffed the phone into her bag and walked briskly toward her car parked a short distance away. I stayed hidden, watching her leave. I waited until the street was empty before approaching the building. The door was locked, but a small security camera above the entrance blinked red. Someone inside was monitoring things. I knocked once, not expecting an answer. To my surprise, the door opened almost immediately. A man in his mid-40s peered out. His eyes narrowed as he sized me up. "Can I help you?" he asked in a tone that suggested he didn't really care for the answer. I hesitated. I was looking for someone. I think my wife just came in here." His expression shifted subtly, but he masked it quickly. "Sorry, don't know what you're talking about." Before I could respond, he started closing the door, but I caught sight of something inside. A large, wall-mounted screen flickered in the background, displaying what looked like financial data. Transfers, account numbers, and lists of names. Rebecca's name was among them. My pulse quickened. "Wait," I said, stepping forward before the door fully shut. "Who are you people?" The man's face hardened. "I think it's time for you to leave." The door slammed in my face before I could say anything else. By the time I made it back to my car, my mind was racing. This wasn't just about Rebecca sneaking around with Ethan. Something bigger was happening, something she had been keeping from me. And suddenly, the pieces started to fall into place. The late nights. The secretive behavior. The strange men leaving the building. Rebecca wasn't having an affair. She was involved in something else, something dangerous. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to her contact. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I hesitated. If she hadn't told me by now, there had to be a reason. I needed more answers before I confronted her. And I knew exactly where to start. Ethan. Ethan wasn't hard to track down. I knew his routine well enough. Rebecca had mentioned him often enough for the details to stick. After leaving the strange building, I drove to his apartment complex on the west side of town. I sat in the parking lot, waiting. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a cold, damp air that fogged up the windshield. I wiped it clear for the 5th time, trying to stay calm. Part of me questioned if I was blowing this out of proportion, but the image of that financial data on the screen refused to leave my mind. What the hell was Rebecca involved in? My phone buzzed. "Rebecca, where are you? I thought you'd be home by now." I stared at the message. She was pretending everything was normal, as if nothing had happened. I typed out a reply but deleted it. "Not yet." A few minutes later, Ethan's silver sedan pulled into the lot. He parked casually and stepped out, carrying a gym bag over his shoulder. He hadn't noticed me. I slipped out of my car and followed him toward the building entrance. The elevator doors were closing when I caught up. I stuck my hand out, forcing them open. Ethan's eyes widened slightly when he saw me. He tensed but masked it quickly with a casual smile. "Daniel. What are you doing here?" I stepped inside, letting the doors slide shut behind me. "I was hoping we could talk." He shifted his bag, pretending not to notice the weight of my stare. "Sure. About what?" I folded my arms. "Rebecca. And the building on 7th Street. Ethan's eyes flickered with recognition, but he quickly looked away. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." I leaned in slightly. "I think you do. I followed you both. I saw you at the cafe. And I saw Rebecca walk into that place." The elevator climbed slowly, floor by floor, but the tension inside grew heavier by the second. Ethan let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, Daniel, I don't think it's my place to explain." I clenched my fists at my sides. "No. But you're going to anyway." The elevator stopped, and the doors slid open to his floor. Ethan hesitated but stepped out. I followed. His apartment was at the end of the hall. He unlocked the door and gestured for me to come inside, The place was sparse, barely furnished, with only a few personal items scattered around. A laptop sat open on the small kitchen table, glowing faintly. Ethan dropped his gym bag by the door and turned to face me. "You're right," he admitted, sighing heavily. "It's not what you think." I narrowed my eyes. "Then explain it to me." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "Rebecca's not having an affair. At least not with me." I froze. "What?" Ethan gestured to the couch, but I stayed standing. "She's not cheating, Daniel. But she is hiding something from you." I felt a rush of confusion and anger. "Then what the hell is going on?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Rebecca's been involved in, let's just call it a side project. It's not illegal, but it's not exactly above board either." "That's not an answer." He nodded, clearly expecting me to say that. "Rebecca and we've been moving money. Large amounts. Quietly. She's been handling certain transfers for people who prefer to stay off the grid." I stared at him, unblinking. "You're telling me my wife is laundering money?" Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, it's not laundering. It's more like discreet investments. Rebecca connects high-profile clients with offshore opportunities. No one gets hurt, and nothing's stolen. But it's risky." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "She's been doing this for months?" I asked. Ethan nodded. "Almost a year, actually. I only got involved recently." I stepped back, shaking my head. This wasn't the Rebecca I knew. "Why didn't she tell me?" I asked, more to myself than to Ethan. He gave a small shrug. "Maybe she was protecting you. Or maybe she thought you'd try to stop her." The pieces started falling into place: the strange men, the secrecy, the cryptic message on her phone. But one thing still didn't make sense. "Why were you hiding in my closet?" I demanded, my voice sharp. Ethan's expression hardened. "That wasn't part of the plan," he admitted. "I went over to discuss something with Rebecca, but when you showed up unexpectedly, she panicked. Told me to hide." I felt my blood boil. "And you listened?" "She said it was easier than explaining everything right then," he replied calmly. I stared at him, trying to decide whether to punch him or thank him for finally telling me the truth. Instead, I turned toward the door. "This isn't over," I muttered. Ethan didn't try to stop me. I drove home, my mind racing with every word Ethan had said. By the time I stepped inside, Rebecca was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea as if nothing had happened. She looked up and smiled faintly. "Hey. Long day?" I set my keys down, meeting her gaze. "You tell me," I replied quietly. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the shift in my tone. "Daniel, what's wrong?" I crossed the room slowly, leaning against the counter. "I know about the building on 7th Street, I said carefully. Her hand froze on the teacup. "I know about the transfers. The clients." Rebecca didn't speak, but I could see the mask cracking, layer by layer. And for the first time, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't expected. Not fear. Not guilt. But relief. Rebecca set the teacup down slowly, her fingers lingering on the handle as if savoring the last few seconds of normalcy. I watched her closely, expecting denial, excuses, something. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long, measured breath. "So, you followed me," she said quietly, without looking up. I crossed my arms. "I had to." "You weren't going to tell me." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze fixed on a spot beyond me, as if replaying the events of the day in her head. "I wasn't sure how much you'd found out," she admitted. "But I guess Ethan filled in the blanks." I frowned. "Why didn't you just tell me from the start?" What could possibly justify sneaking around like this? Rebecca finally looked at me, her eyes sharper now, calculating. Because you wouldn't have understood. There was no apology in her voice, no attempt to soften the blow. I stepped closer, leaning over the table. Try me. For a moment, she studied me, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, with a slight nod, Rebecca reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen a few times before sliding it across the table. I glanced down. A series of transactions appeared, long columns of figures, account numbers, and foreign currencies. Some of the amounts made my head spin. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. What am I looking at? I asked, scrolling through the data. Rebecca folded her hands. Private transfers. High-level clients who prefer not to go through banks. I facilitate it. I shook my head in disbelief. That sounds an awful lot like money laundering to me. It's not, she said firmly. It's off-the-record investing. Think of it as repositioning assets. A loophole. I scoffed. And you think that makes it better? She met my eyes without flinching. I think it makes it profitable. I set the phone down, my pulse quickening. How long have you been doing this? Rebecca hesitated for just a fraction of a second. About 14 months. 14 months. Longer than I'd thought. I felt like the ground beneath me was shifting, the woman sitting across from me unfamiliar in ways I couldn't quite grasp. Rebecca, what the hell are you involved in? Her lips curved into something that resembled a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm not involved, Daniel. I'm running it. I blinked. Running it? She nodded. I'm the one who brought Ethan in. The men you saw at the building? They answered to me. I took a step back, struggling to process what I was hearing. This doesn't make sense, I muttered. Rebecca's gaze softened just slightly, and for the first time, I caught a glimpse of the woman I married, the woman who used to laugh at my bad jokes and hold my hand during movies. I know this isn't what you expected, she said gently. But you've seen how unpredictable the world's become. People want security. They want control over their money. I offer them that. I stared at her, heart pounding. So, you've been building some underground empire behind my back? She gave a soft chuckle. Empire's a strong word. It's more like a very profitable side hustle. My head spun. This wasn't just some affair or midlife crisis. Rebecca had been playing a different game entirely, and I had been blind to it. Does anyone else know? I asked quietly. Her expression darkened slightly. Only Ethan. And now you. I paused, narrowing my eyes. What does that mean? Rebecca leaned forward, her gaze locking onto mine. It means I trust you to keep this between us. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happens if I don't? I asked carefully. Her expression didn't change. I'd rather not think about that. The house felt too small, the walls pressing in on me as I paced the living room later that night. Rebecca had gone to bed as if nothing had happened, leaving me to wrestle with the storm raging inside my head. I poured a glass of whiskey and stared at the framed photos lining the mantel. One of them caught my eye, a vacation shot from 3 years ago. Rebecca and I standing by the ocean, her arm looped through mine. We looked happy. Uncomplicated. I wondered how much of it had been real. The door creaked behind me, and I turned to see Rebecca standing in the doorway. She wore one of my old t-shirts, her hair pulled back loosely. You're still up, she said softly. I set the glass down. Yeah. Hard to sleep. Rebecca crossed the room slowly, sitting down on the couch. She patted the space beside her. I hesitated but joined her. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she broke the silence. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she whispered. "But I'm not sorry for what I've built." I glanced at her. "Even if it cost you us?" Rebecca's gaze flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Or something else. "I didn't think it would," she replied softly. I turned to face her fully. "And now?" She met my eyes, her hand finding mine on the cushion between us. "I guess that depends on you." Her grip tightened just slightly. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was holding onto my wife. Or if she was holding onto me. The weight of Rebecca's hand in mine lingered, but the silence between us felt heavier. I could feel her watching me, waiting for some kind of answer, some sign that I wasn't about to walk away. But I wasn't sure I could walk away. "I need to know one thing," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. Rebecca shifted, sitting up straighter. "Anything." I swallowed the knot in my throat and looked her directly in the eyes. "Did you ever think about telling me? Or was I just part of the cover story?" Her face softened, and for a brief moment, I saw something break through that hardened exterior, something raw and honest. "I thought about telling you every day," she admitted. "But once it started, I didn't know how to stop. And the deeper I went, the harder it became to pull you into it." I let that sink in, unsure if it made things better or worse. "I didn't want to lose you, Daniel," she whispered. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my face with my free hand. "And now?" Rebecca's grip on my hand tightened, and when I glanced at her, there was a flicker of fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that came with knowing too much. "Now," she said softly, "you're already in it." I let her words hang between us, feeling the finality in them. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or understanding. She was telling me the truth, and for better or worse, we were bound by it now. I didn't know if I could ever fully trust her again. But as I sat there, her hand in mine, I realized that trust wasn't the only thing holding us together. It was the secrets. And secrets, once shared, were harder to walk away from. That night, as Rebecca drifted off to sleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, wondering where we would go from here. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure who was protecting who. But I knew one thing: whatever this was, whatever we were now, I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet.